Software Development Sessions from Microsoft Ignite 2022 here on Programming with Palermo.
You are programming with Palermo. You deliver software. You need to move fast, deliver quality, and run your software with confidence. Stay tuned for timeless solutions, simple methods, and topics that will propel you forward. And now your host, lifelong programmer, author, teacher, coach, Christian, and charismatic speaker, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to Programming with Palermo. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host. Hope you're doing really well. Last week, and at the time of this recording, Microsoft held its Ignite 2022 conference. And the Ignite conference is always known for being a ton of information for general IT, but they always have some really good nuggets for software development. If you want a conference that's purely about software development, then you go for the Microsoft Build conference. But Ignite happened last week, and today on this episode of Programming with Palermo, I'm going to highlight 12 sessions that are hugely relevant for software development and talk to you about why I think that they're interesting and why I think that you should give these 12 a look. So thanks, and let's get into it. So the URL is ignite.microsoft.com, and the first session we're going to highlight is Making Cloud Native Easier, Architecting the Next Generation Azure PaaS. And this is Brady Gaster, Scott Hunter, and Kendall Roden. Actually, all three I've had as guests on the Azure DevOps podcast. So you can go back in the show notes and look at that. But this was a really interesting and code-filled session. I tend to like running pretty much all of these presentations at higher speed. So I like to come in and for me, comfortable is 1.5 speed. That's for the average speaker. And if someone is a particularly fast speaker, I might bump it down to 1.25. If they're a particularly slower speaker, I bump it up to 1.75. That's just me. But I rarely listen to anything pre-recorded, whether it be audio or video, at normal speed anymore. And you can also download the videos for offline usage, and you can mess around with the quality. But that's what I like to do. And so this session is really interesting because they go through the code of items that actually make it easier, make it a better fit for running it in the platform as a service features of Azure. So I'd recommend you take a look on that one. And that's the first of the 12 sessions. The second session that I'd encourage you to take a look at is Deep Dive into Dapper and Cloud Native Architectures. This is Donovan Brown, and he shares a ton of demos, and then he also walks through a lot of code personally on making things go. And he also highlights GitHub code spaces because the demos that he's using is actually running VS Code in a GitHub code spaces on a GitHub code spaces VM, kind of as a lightweight IDE on demand. Now, most of his demos are not, well, they're C# and JavaScript and other languages. So it's not just .NET. Obviously, there's plenty of stuff with .NET that you can't quite do in GitHub code spaces since it's VS Code on Linux. But he does a good job of showing what you can do and highlighting Dapper and why that's interesting. The next session I just wanted to highlight and encourage you to look at is Hidden Gems in Live Coding with .NET 7. This is from Damian Edwards and David Fowler. And these two are really entertaining, kind of going back and forth. But they highlight some existing things that are already in .NET. I think there might have been one that was .NET 7, but for the most part, most of these are already in .NET 6, and you could be using these right away, even though .NET 7 is coming out just in a few weeks. And they highlight a lot of tricks with the middleware. So that's a really interesting session. The next session is how Visual Studio builds Visual Studio with Visual Studio. So this is Fatima and Mark, and they are both on the Visual Studio team, and they talk about how difficult that it historically has been to run, to build and test and get ready for release Visual Studio, because of how large a product is and how many gigabytes it uses. But then they go through the progression of breaking it down, whereas it used to take, once they were done, it would take 3 weeks to release a new build of Visual Studio, and now it's really, really quick. So that's just an interesting story on how they went from slow and cumbersome and not fun to fast and more fun. So that's an interesting session. The next session I want to highlight is Minimal APIs, the Magic Revealed. And this is Safia Abdallah and Stephen Halter. And they start out by talking about the kind of the architecture and structure of minimal APIs, endpoint routing. And then this is one where you are going to be pausing and looking at the code in the screen, and then going forward and pausing and looking at the code, because this is, I think they have it labeled as maybe a 300 level session. I would say this is a 400 level session. There is just a ton of code, deep dive into how minimal APIs works and how you can really leverage all the under the covers power. So this gets really past all the simple demos of minimal APIs, and this is probably the deepest presentation on minimal APIs that I've seen. They should have called it maximal APIs, perhaps. All right, the next session is increasing productivity and quality for hybrid development, and this one, it doesn't have a lot of code. It's kind of slides and concepts, but Mads Christensen gives a really good overview of how we should think about hybrid development. And so it's not a deep in the code talk. It's just one of those kind of for your brain, because there's a ton of organizations that have developers and other team members that are working in a semi-remote, even if everybody's in the same town, not doing everything in the office and doing more from home. And Microsoft is pushing out a ton of new capabilities for hybrid development teams. Kind of that's their buzzword that they've been pushing over this Ignite and remote teams. So the Mads does a good job of kind of how Microsoft is thinking about this for you to keep up with.
Programming with Palermo is brought to you by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their software with confidence in Azure. If your team has a project that's too important to be delayed or derailed, ClearMeasure can help, while keeping your team in the driver's seat and growing in capability. Click on clearmeasure.com for more information. If you are an architect or .NET engineer aspiring to become an architect, check out clearmeasure.com/careers. Now, back to the show.
Next session is Pragmatic Production Debugging in Azure. This is another one of those sessions where you're going to pause and look at the code and the screens. But this is Mark Downey and Catherine Wang, and they go absolutely deep in debugging capabilities in Azure. We've all had those situations where you have no bugs, everything works in a pre-production environment, and something wonky is going on in production, and you just need to figure out and get some intelligence as to what's actually happening. And so this talk is packed with techniques that you can use to get that insight into what your code is actually doing while it's running in Azure. So this is a good session. Next session is 7 tips for building robust cloud applications. And Lars Klint from Pluralsight does a good job at talking about cloud applications and some things to do in the application itself, but also in your Azure configuration for increasing the reliability and the resiliency of the application while it's running in Azure. So I wanted to highlight that one. The next session is implementing effective DevSecOps for Azure. And that term DevSecOps, it's kind of clumsy, I'll admit. I don't really like it, but when you're talking about DevOps and you want to talk about security as it relates to DevOps, well, DevSecOps seems to be the term. And this one is a little bit lighter on code, but it's more about concepts. And so give this one a listen. I'm highlighting the slide here that talks about the average cost of a flaw or cost of a problem, cost of a defect when it comes to being a security defect along the way, from when you find it in the code versus when you find it in QA testing versus when you find it when it's out in the wild running in production. So give that one a listen. The next one is make building cloud native solutions a breeze with Visual Studio Code, GitHub, and Azure Container Apps. This is another one that is chock full of code and command lines, and you're going to be pausing, kind of looking at the commands. But Azure Container Apps, I have high hopes for this. I've had several of the episodes on the Azure DevOps podcast talk about Azure Container Apps. It is Kubernetes. It is Kubernetes with the easy tooling of Azure App Service wrapped around the top. So I have high hopes for Azure Container Apps. I'm pushing on Azure Container Apps. It is early, but it's GA. It's running. Lots of people are having success with it. And this session kind of walks through from beginning to all the way through in the process, creating, Dockerizing your application, deploying, and running an Azure Container App. So give that a look. Next one is called Supercharge Your Testing Practice with UiPath Test Suite. And this is a partner talk by UiPath, but testing is so important that at least give this a look. I'm not plugging any particular product, but test suites. We all need test suites so that we know every method of every class is doing what it's supposed to. Every conduit between our application and some dependency is doing what it's supposed to. And when the whole application is put together and is running in a production-like environment, that everything is behaving as it is intended to do. And so we need, at a minimum, 3 levels of test suites on any application, regardless of what the application is doing. And so I'm glad that there's a lot of innovation going in the space when it comes to more full system testing, where you're thinking through kind of a full user scenario. And this is one of the tools that was highlighted at Ignite. And the last one, kind of in the same vein, is automated cloud application testing with Azure and Playwright. And this is Scott Hanselman and Jennifer Parrott, and they're going through the new Playwright tool for doing full system testing through a web application browser, through the browser. So this Playwright is aimed squarely at Selenium users. Selenium has been used for many, many, many years. I think I first used Selenium maybe back in, 2006 or 2007. And, that wasn't even when it came out. So Selenium has really been a workhorse of through the browser testing. And right now, if you're not doing full system testing and you want something that's super mature, then Selenium will do the job really well. But it's got some rough edges, and of course, with all of the richer types of web applications that have come out, Selenium was initially built for page-based applications, so you have to do some adapting. I'm really excited that Microsoft is innovating on another test framework for through the browser testing, and Playwright is one of those. So make sure to give this session a look, and that is the 12 sessions from the 2022 Microsoft Ignite that are software development focused, that I think that you should absolutely give a look. I hope that was helpful. These were 12 sessions that I think you should give a look from Microsoft's Ignite Conference 2022. Play them on 1.5 speed, flip through them. That's the beauty of recorded content. So these are the 12 that I think are really, really interesting from a software development perspective. So give those a listen. Thanks for being with me on Programming with Palermo, and I hope you have a good day. God bless.
You've been watching Programming with Palermo, your primary place for highly productive programming protocols and practices. Remember, you have what it takes. You can do this. You are a programmer, formed by God Himself and called to this profession for a purpose. You can catch every episode at Palermo.network, as well as syndicated locations nationwide. We're so glad you tuned in. Until next time, may God bless you, and thanks for programming with Palermo. Programming with Palermo has made a special arrangement with Marketplace Chaplains. Besides programming challenges, we all face issues in life where we need some help. If you'd like, you can call a chaplain confidentially. To speak with a gentleman, dial 512-923-8178. Or to speak with a lady, dial 512-619-6950. The show won't know you called, and everything is kept in strict secrecy. This is a free service, available if you or a friend need it.